One day at a formal dinner, Emperor Caligula suddenly burst into loud laughter, full of surprise, when asked to explain why his response had turned out to be so disturbing and provocative. This incident is hard to forget because it vividly reflects the internal dramatic tension and oddities that marked his rule. Caligula, known in history as one of the cruelest and most unpredictable rulers of Rome, reigned from AD 37 to AD 41. His reign left a numerous imprint in memory as an era of chaos, brutal tyranny, and mad actions that ultimately led to his violent death. Furthermore, it is important to note that Caligula came from a prominent dynasty of Roman leaders. His ancestors included distinguished and renowned figures. His great-grandmother was Julia Caesar, a famous female ruler. His ancestor was Augustus, the first emperor of the capital, and his father was Germanicus, one of the most acclaimed and popular generals in Roman history. This individual was surrounded by recognition and respect both for his outstanding military achievements and personal qualities. But, unfortunately, he became a testament to how far one could fall from such noble lineage. In childhood, young Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus often wore a small soldier's tunic when his father took him on campaigns. As a result, soldiers, observing this, started calling him Caligula, which translates to little boots. This nickname became associated with him, eventually turning into a name that symbolized not only childhood innocence, but also the complex fate of the ruler himself. Caligula was born during the last day of the imperial rule of Rome's first emperor. His adoptive father, Emperor Augustus, who was regarded as the first true Caesar, designated his stepson Tiberius as heir. However, on the condition that Tiberius would someday make a great general, Germanicus, his successor. Tiberius agreed, unaware that all subsequent plans would collapse like a house of cards. One of Tiberius's first steps after ascending to the throne was to send Germanicus on a diplomatic mission. But under mysterious circumstances, this powerful general soon fell ill and died, an event that shook Rome to its core. In an era when power and intrigue were constant companions among the ruling circles, Germanicus's death gave rise to numerous rumors. The people suspected Tiberius was involved, and gossip spread that he was responsible for this deadly incident. The hostility between different strata of Roman high society reached such proportions that the consequences were destructive and brutal. Young Caligula barely survived the disasters that followed his father's death. Caligula's mother, accusing Tiberius of killing Germanicus, sought revenge. In response, Tiberius initiated his bloody reprisals. He accused her and two of Caligula's older brothers of treason. As a result, one of his sisters, Agrippina, died of hunger in exile on a remote island, while two brothers were imprisoned. One of them also died of hunger in captivity, and the events resembled a bloody show staged in the heart of the powerful Roman Empire. It was in such conditions that young Caligula grew and was shaped, witnessing brutal executions and political intrigues that determined the fates of millions. His destiny became closely intertwined with the tragedy and cruelty of the era in which he grew up, leaving an indelible mark on his soul. His entire life was deeply connected to the tragedies and injustices surrounding him. Once, one of his relatives committed suicide instantly, leaving behind a sense of terrible emptiness, devastation, and profound grief. During these chaotic years of endless upheavals, when entire families disappeared and lives were shattered, young Caligula was still too impoverished to fully grasp the heavy burden of power. He remained protected for a time. His mother, a great-grandmother named Livia, carefully shielded her nephew from the brutal intrigues and political battles, keeping him away from the seat of power. But everything changed in a single tragic moment. Tiberius, Caligula's father, suddenly died, possibly murdered at the behest of a political rival. The exact cause of his death remains unknown, but the entire story became a turning point. Tiberius no longer had an heir. On one of the days in the year 31 AD, Tiberius summoned Caligula to the luxury island known as Capri, where the ruler usually spent his time indulging in entertainment and pleasures. There, he made a decision. to take the boy into his family and officially adopt him. However, Caligula was not grateful for this. He harbored deep hatred for Tiberius, for everything that happened, for his father's death, and for interference in his fate. Despite this, the emperor still made Caligula his heir, an astonishing decision, given his hostility. Why did Tiberius act this way? Modern historians leave this question unanswered. However, it is known that in his youth, Caligula possessed an extraordinary talent for acting. He could hide his true feelings and play the role of a submissive servant. He performed his role so convincingly that one of the historiographers remarked, "There had never been a more devoted servant or a more brutal master." Even before becoming emperor, Caligula exhibited tendencies toward cruelty and vices. He took pleasure in witnessing executions, indulging in scandalous behavior and unacceptable entertainments. In the evenings, when his mind grew increasingly unstable, he would say, "I am nurturing a hostile snake in the heart of Rome." He often boasted that he once carried a dagger into Tiberius's bedroom. His goal was to assassinate the emperor, to avenge his mother and brothers. When he entered the room and found Tiberius sleeping, his heart suddenly changed, and he abandoned his original plan. Yet at the same time, he still had the feeling that he was capable of doing otherwise. Only he chose not to. During his stay at Tiberius's house as a guest, Caligula befriended Sertorius Macro, the leader of a powerful and influential Praetorian Guard. Macro's words helped soften Tiberius's attitude toward the young heir, and his influence seemed to be a blessing for Caligula. However, over time, Macro deeply regretted ever having met this man. As one of the ancient historians, Tacitus, writes, Macro ultimately smothered the dying Tiberius with a pillow to ensure that Caligula would ascend the throne. Other sources claim that it was Caligula himself, rumors suggest, who played a key role in Tiberius's death to secure his own rise to emperor. The truth in these versions remains unclear, leaving room for debates and speculation. But the outcome was obvious. Caligula took the throne, and a new power shook Rome. During the last years of his reign, Caligula completely destroyed the foundations of the empire, plunging the country into chaos and lawlessness, while he himself sheltered in his opulent palace on the island of Capri, enjoying peace and carefree indulgence. Meanwhile, the residents of Rome, left unprotected and without order, fell under the influence of an unknown threat, as the empire they loved and built so passionately gradually disintegrated under the pressing weight of indifference and madness of their ruler. By the time Tiberius died, he was already universally hated, and with the accession of the new emperor, Gaius Caligula, the people of Rome greeted the changes with joy. On the day of Tiberius's funeral, Gaius delivered a passionate, touching speech in honor of the late emperor, expressing his feelings through tears and sincere words. According to historical sources, he prepared a splendid and very solemn burial to immortalize the memory of the former ruler. Caligula's ability to work with the public and inspire the people was characteristic of him, and he demonstrated this talent especially vividly on the day of Tiberius's funeral. Despite his absolute hatred for the man who had killed his family, and even despite his personal animosity, Caligula managed to evoke a sense of hope among the Romans. His background was quite noble. He traced his lineage to distinguished ancestors, and many sympathized with his childhood sufferings, believing he could live up to their expectations. And in essence, he did begin to fulfill the hopes of his compatriots. He first freed unjustly imprisoned citizens, increased military rewards, and abolished a very unpopular tax. The Roman historian Fabius described the first few months of his reign as a happy and prosperous time, filled with mercy and positive change. But this idyll did not last long, and its end came quite soon. 6 months after Caligula ascended the throne, he suddenly fell ill, most likely after poisoning. He recovered, but according to accounts, the illness shattered something inside his mind, and the consequences of this tragic event shocked the entire society of Rome. The emperor began to ruthlessly deal with his family. His first victims were his cousin and heir Gellus, and his grandmother was furious, expressing horror and indignation. But soon, she too died. Subsequently, Caligula executed his father-in-law and brother-in-law, as well as banished his two sisters. Watching these events unfold, it seemed that the emperor himself might have died from the illness. But in the political game, to save his career, his associate Macra devised a series of maneuvers. When Caligula regained consciousness, he discovered Macra's plans and immediately condemned his former ally, forcing him into a terrible fate, compelling Macra, for all he owed, to take his own life. During these grim days, after virtually destroying his family, Caligula executed almost all close relatives. The only exception was his frail and elderly uncle Claudius, whom the emperor left alive, not without irony, as a figure of ridicule. The first years on the throne proved to be a truly crazy journey, as almost everything he did was linked to one common trait: huge expenses. Whether building opulent palaces, spectacular festivals, or pursuing politics, each decision cost enormous amounts of money and made his reign increasingly expensive and risky for the state. Caligula did not stop at merely collecting taxes or extravagantly spending state funds on personal pleasures. Everything became incredibly costly, and funds in Rome began to run out quickly. The second emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty did not see himself as an ordinary ruler. He perceived himself as a deity, and even openly expressed contempt for the true gods worshipped in Rome. This pride and anger toward religious traditions led him to order the heads of statues of various gods across the city to be removed and replaced with his own likeness. Many ancient and modern historians have tried to understand what caused such furious, mad rage in Caligula. Some speculated that he suffered from epilepsy, while others believed that he constantly lived in fear of losing control and collapsing during seizures, which made him paranoid and cruel. Moreover, evidence supporting the epilepsy hypothesis comes from numerous sources stating that Caligula could not swim, despite swimming lessons being part of his education. Perhaps he was afraid that if he tried to swim, he might have a seizure and drown. According to witnesses, Caligula was not known for physical strength or endurance. Slim, pale, and appears sickly, with empty eyes and thin hair, he seemed much more like a weak patient than a strong leader. Throughout his life, he experienced periods of intense weakness when he could hardly perform even the simplest actions. By roughly the middle of Caligula's reign, he severed ties with the Senate and began exploiting every opportunity to humiliate its members. In the year 39 AD, without consulting the senators, he replaced all the consuls and restructured the entire Senate Council, demonstrating his power and only maintaining them to belittle them. He forced senators to run alongside his chariot, dressed in all their regalia, and watched with a sneer as they suffered and were humiliated, simultaneously creating an atmosphere of chaos and arbitrariness for those around him. However, with all this cruelty and madness, he likely paid for it with his life. The organization of gladiatorial fights was not only a means to display wealth and power, but also a form of Roman justice. Criminals and slaves were often sacrificed in the arena to entertain spectators, instilling fear and sowing unrest. But for a bloodthirsty individual like Caligula, that was not enough. Once the emperor, tired of the monotonous spectacle of Roman entertainment, ordered his soldiers to throw a whole group of spectators to the beast's jaws to amuse the crowd. Soon, his behavior grew increasingly insane and brutal, and his actions only deepened the anxiety that gripped the empire. Cuirassiers and harsh critics began openly questioning his actions, and he soon became one of the most hated people in the entire empire. However, for Caligula himself, this was not a cause for concern. He was confident in his divine nature. He simply told himself, "Let them hate me, as long as they fear me." And that was precisely what he was aiming for. The army, the Senate, and ordinary citizens could not remain indifferent to his cruel acts and madness, and each year, discontent grew. It was especially intense among the highest levels of authority, where it became increasingly difficult to hide deep-seated hostility. Finally, in the year 40 AD, Caligula committed an act that ultimately sealed his fate. He decided to move his capital to Egypt, to the city of Alexandria. The idea of a permanent relocation seemed unacceptable to many outsiders. For the emperor, it would mean a complete abdication of power over Rome and the Italian provinces. Thus, by moving, he would deprive the Senate and the Praetorian Guard of a significant part of political influence, effectively neutralizing their power. This plan became an unbearable threat for many rulers. Those close to the emperor also realized this. For example, one of his own guards, named Cassius Cus, knew better than anyone how dangerous this scheme was. He devised a bold and dark conspiracy to end Caligula's madness once and for all. Besides political motives, Caius also harbored personal animosity toward the emperor. Over many years, Caligula had repeatedly mocked him, ridiculed his weak voice, and humiliated him publicly. Probably he did the same to many other people in Rome, causing pain and suffering. But C was alone, and he had to take drastic measures. On January 22nd, AD 41, while in his luxurious palace and engaged in conversation with a group of young actors, he had no idea that a deadly trap was already set. At that moment, a group of conspirators, including C himself, appeared in the corridors. According to reports, he was the first to strike, and then his accomplices joined him. The crowd rushed at the emperor, ruthlessly crushing and injuring him right where he stood. What is strange about this is that fate arranged it so. Caligula's death became one of the most shocking moments in the history of the Roman Empire. The moments leading up to Caligula's death closely resembled the final hours of his great ancestor, Julius Caesar, in their dramatic intensity. Both only lacked an exact date to make their comparisons even more vivid. Both were great dictators, wielding absolute power, and both met tragic ends as a result of treachery. In Caesar's case, it was a conspiracy led by a prominent man named Brutus, while in Caligula's case, it was a group of conspirators headed by one of them named Cassius. However, even though the Imperial Guard Corps of Praetoria turned against Caligula, his personal German security detail remained loyal to their master until the very end. When yet another tragic scene unfolded, the emperor's body was already lying lifeless, but this did not stop a fierce outburst of revenge from the few loyal soldiers. They ruthlessly attacked everyone present, whether conspirators or mere bystanders. After killing Caligula, they did not stop and turned on his wife and young daughter to completely erase all traces of the imperial bloodline. In this act of cruelty, which would evoke admiration in an author of darkly captivating stories like George R.R. Martin, even a child was killed, young Julia Drilla, who was beaten against a wall as if to show that no one and nothing could save the heirs of Caligula's throne. Then, the conspirators set out to find his only remaining relative, the old and sick uncle, Claudius. This man was not particularly brave. His reaction to the tragedy was more like hiding. He had to take cover behind curtains, waiting to be discovered. Fortunately for him, one sympathetic soldier found him in time, and part of the guards quickly organized his evacuation out of the city, ensuring his safety. The situation at that time could have ended in disaster for the Roman Empire, as the outcome of such a bloody internal conflict could have led to the complete destruction of the state structure. However, it must be acknowledged that, from a political point of view, his reign served as a stark example of why absolute power in one person can bring more harm than benefit to the state. Subsequently, the Senate decided to restore the republican system, and efforts to do so began quite actively. However, a serious problem arose. Despite the overthrow of Caligula, his reign was one of the most disastrous in the history of the empire. At the same time, the army remained loyal to the concept of the empire and sought to preserve its existence. As a result, they rallied around the figure of an awkward but already popular among the military pretender, Claudius, who quickly gained support. The newly declared emperor did not delay and immediately set about punishing the killers of his nephew, eliminating his rivals, and restoring order. In the end, the empire continued to exist, and the most insane ruler was removed. Caligula truly had a sinister sense of humor. Once, during a formal dinner, he reportedly burst into wicked laughter. His companions asked what was so funny, and he replied, "I just thought about giving the order, and you all would end up with your throats cut." This ominous joke perfectly illustrates his despotic nature and sadistic personality, because behind this gruesome irony lay his tendency toward cruelty and a relentless, torturous game with the fates of those around him. If you enjoyed this selection, be sure to give it a like. Subscribe so you won't miss new and interesting videos that we will prepare for you in the future.